At the end of July 2014, the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine turned into a real war. The flow of military hardware, soldiers and weapons that came from the Russian Federation long ago turned into mighty rivers. And in these mighty waters, besides ideological fighters for the Russian language, there were also tanks, artillery and tons of ammunition supplied to them. To suppress these deadly supplies along the state border, the regiments of the 24th, 51st, 72nd and 79th Brigades of the Armed Forces of Ukraine took their positions along the border, firing at the oncoming gas transport trucks and tanks from Russia. From the heaps of waste drew a lot of blood from the enemy. But they did not have enough strength to establish complete control over the state border, and by the end of July, the situation in the Sector B became critical. In early August, it became apparent that without adequate supply and locked in a narrow space between the Russian soldiers and the militants, Ukrainian units were no longer able to carry out their tasks. A thin line of conditionally controlled territory was shot through. The enemy mined roads and fired at supply columns. Not having enough forces to control the ways of delivering weapons and bearing losses from constant shelling from the territory of Russia, the troops at the border ended up being totally surrounded. The ATO headquarters developed a plan for the release of troops of Sector D. To accomplish this task, it was necessary to take siege of the burial mounds of Urmahila and the towns of Stepanivka and Marinivka, and also gain control over the crossing of the river Mius. The 95th and 30th Brigades dealt the main blow, while regiments of the 25th and 51st Brigades carried special operations to distract the attacking enemy. On August 1st, the villages of Novy Svit and Krasnohorivka were liberated. Also, the village of Kontarne was liberated in the area of Savurmahila, as well as Stepanivka and Marinivka over the course of several days of heavy battle. On the night of August 2nd, Grad rocket launcher systems were fired upon the Luhansk airport. At the same time, thanks to intelligence reports received from the local population, the Ukrainian units managed to defeat a large column of the enemy, which was moving from the state border towards Luhansk. 7 tanks, 5 armored personnel carriers, 3 Grad installations and 7 military transport trucks carrying heavy ammunition were destroyed. The loss of militants in terms of manpower amounted to more than 100. On the same day, Staromikhailivka was liberated, and in the neighboring Mariinka, the ATO forces seized 2 checkpoints of terrorists and went to the outskirts of Donetsk. On August 3rd, the Security Service of Ukraine conducted a large-scale special operation, as a result of which about 300 terrorists were detained. Among them were 11 Russians, as well as citizens of other states. The weapons and explosives that the militants were planning to use, including outside the ATO zone, were immediately confiscated. For the Russian Federation, it was important to gain a psychological victory more than anything. The ultimate task of Russia was to ensure the surrender of Ukraine. This could have been achieved in 2 ways, either by demonstrating the lack of the combat capability of the Ukrainian army or provoking it to fire back at the enemy. This would give rise to a full-scale invasion, which the armed forces of Ukraine would not be able to repulse. At the night of August 4th, 274 soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the 72nd Brigade and 164 border guards destroyed their weapons and equipment, left their positions and crossed the border. With the mediation of the OSCE, the soldiers requested asylum on Russian territory. The Ukrainian soldiers did this due to the lack of ammunition, food and water. In view of the fact that Russia did not officially recognize its participation in the war, it was technically impossible to capture these soldiers. This situation was widely broadcast in the mass media, and the Russian propagandists sought to expose the Ukrainian army in an unfavorable light. Here it should be noted that none of these soldiers expressed a desire to stay in Russia, and all of them immediately returned to Ukraine within a matter of a few days. Despite the information pressure, the lack of ammunition, the shortage of food and water, some soldiers still refused to cross the border with the territory of Russia and decided to make their way to Ukrainian territory. This group was headed by the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 72nd Brigade, Mikhailo Drapati. On August 4th, Major Drapati gathered a group of more than 300 soldiers and officers and advanced along the border towards Dyakove. As he moved forward, he also gathered the units of the 51st Brigade and went to join forces with the 79th Brigade. At the same time, the forces of the 95th and 30th Brigades established the corridor to meet Ukrainian troops that were pulling out of the encirclement. By the evening of August 5th, units of the 72nd Brigade came to the command post of the 79th Brigade in the area of Dyakove. All this time, Russian artillery systematically fired at the positions of the Ukrainian military. One of the leaders of the militants, Ryazan, came out on the radio with the deputy commander of the 79th Brigade, Valery Kurach. He proposed forming a green corridor, according to which Ukrainian soldiers could leave without weapons and equipment. However, such a move would actually have meant a surrender at the mercy of terrorists without any guarantees. The Ukrainian commander refused this proposal. The next day, 5 columns were lined up ready to go for a breakthrough. Time, order, and exit routes were designated. The columns came out with a half-hour interval in the direction of Snizhne, bypassing the strongly fortified Dmitrivka. At the same time, units of the 30th and 95th Brigades launched an offensive towards Latyshev and Rosypne, towards the outgoing columns. One of the main tasks of these units was the organization of the crossing over the river Mius, for which special hardware was used, specifically heavy bridge-laying machines. Not far from the crossing, key heights were occupied. The first column, using the factor of surprise, came out almost without countermeasures from the enemy side. But the third column was fired at constantly, both from Torres and from the Russian territory. During the period from August 6th to 7th, up to 5 battalions from the 24th, 51st, 72nd and 79th Brigades, as well as border guardsmen, managed to pull out from the encirclement. On August 7th, the terrorist leader, the so-called chairman of the Council of Ministers of DPR, Alexander Borodai, announced his resignation. In this position, he was replaced by a local businessman, leader of the terrorist group Aplot and commandant of Donetsk, Alexander Zakharchenko. The following fact is noteworthy. Just at the time when the last columns of Ukrainian troops pulled out of the encirclement, the chairman of the Council of Ministers declared that Ukrainian troops near the border had almost surrendered. Zakharchenko spoke about 800 Ukrainian soldiers who were captured. In reality, as a result of concerted actions, about 300 soldiers and more than 250 units of military hardware left the place. In the process, there were no losses, but the operation itself cost the lives of 11 soldiers during the week and 74 were injured. The protection of the occupied territory was entrusted to the 3rd Battalion of the 30th Brigade. After the successful withdrawal of troops from the Sector D encirclement, the strike units of the 30th and 95th Brigades moved towards Myusinsk. The next task was to create a barrier along the line Stepanivka-Myusinsk, Chervona Polyana, Lutugine. This was done with the same goal – to isolate the militants from deliveries of hardware from Russian territory. On August 8th, the link between the Horlivka and Makeyevka occupied by terrorists was destroyed. Forces of the 95th Brigade took the road between the towns of Antratsit and Chervony Luch. Then the 1st Battalion of the 30th Brigade entered the town of Myusinsk. It was in the battles for this small town that the Ukrainian fighters first came head-to-head with military units of the Russian Federation, including young soldiers on a regular basis. The latter did not even understand where they were and thought that these were training sessions being held in Rostov region in Russia. To support the actions of the 1st Battalion, from the north, the 2nd Battalion of the 30th Brigade moved. At the same time, in Myusinsk, the street battle broke out. Russian propaganda claimed that only a small group of local militia operated against the strike battalion of the armed forces of Ukraine. It was not surprising, since Russian journalists had a clear prescription not to divulge any information about the presence of the Russian military. On August 9th, terrorist leader Igor Girkin announced that Krustalny, Horlivka and Donetsk were surrounded. The so-called chairman of DPR, Andrei Purgin, argued that Donetsk was only half surrounded and that the resistance continued. The Ukrainian authorities, in turn, did not confirm the liberation of Krustalny, as this was far from the truth. However, after the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the state border, the Russian Federation was able to freely provide terrorists with hardware, fuel, ammunition, and soldiers. And in attempts to block these supplies, the Ukrainian army again occupied Yakove on August 10th. On the same day, the units of the 95th Brigade left the Antratsit area and returned to Slavyansk to replenish their combat capability. The raid of the 95th Brigade was a part of a large operation, and its main result was the withdrawal of the troops surrounded by the border. Interacting at different stages with other landing and infantry divisions, the battalion of Mikhailo Zabrodsky moved more than 400 kilometers, firing at the enemy and disorganizing the work of the rear services. As it turned out later, this raid wasn't the last and not the most difficult one. On the same day, on August 10th, as part of the Donetsk Operation, an offensive was launched on the little-known city of Ilovaisk. On August 11th, terrorist leader Alexander Zakharchenko declared a rapid counteroffensive of the so-called Donetsk militia. After 2 days, the units of the 18th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of Russian Army started the battle with Ukrainian troops. On August 11, 2014, the border village of Stepanivka in Donetsk region experienced the most brutal shelling from the territory of the Russian Federation. There was not a single building in the village left intact. The fighting continued in Myusinsk, in the vicinity of Ilovaisk and Hrabsky. The Ukrainian army liberated villages of Korsun, Upper Krinka, Monokhove and Krinichne on August 12. Volunteer units also liberated Vuhledar, Pervomaisk, Luhansk region, Kamyshevaha and Kalinove. Also, the town of Vuhlehorsk was liberated. The LPR headquarters stated that units of the 30th and 95th Brigades were surrounded in the Antratsit area. Russian propaganda came up with the ridiculous term "wandering cattle" to describe the situation. These surrounded units continued to carry out their task and moved within the framework of raiding operations, despite the resistance of the militants. The DPR headquarters issued a much more serious statement. The militants claimed that they had prepared about 200 armored vehicles for a counteroffensive near Donetsk, and this was not even about Putin's so-called gifts. The next day, in the area of the village of Stepanivka, the border was crossed by the units of the 18th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, and while earlier only hardware belonging to this brigade from Khankala was found in the Donbas, after August 13th, its soldiers were also detected. On August 11th, Russian President Putin announced the dispatch to Ukraine of a so-called humanitarian convoy, a large convoy of trucks loaded with food and medicine intended for civilians that were injured during the battles. The next day, from the Moscow suburban town of Narofominsk, 280 vehicles departed on their way to Ukraine. On the night of August 13th, the convoy tried to break through to the territory of Kharkiv region, accompanied by military equipment. On the same day, the Ukrainian army liberated the village of Pisky. The border towns of Stepanivka and Marinivka were attacked by Russian troops. While shelling the Luhansk airport, the terrorists committed a blunder firing at one of the villages, where many civilians were injured. At the same time, the ATO forces bypassed Luhansk from the east. This allowed them to block the Luhansk-Krasnodon highway, which was the main artery for the supply of Russian terrorist troops to the city. Due to the fact that the roads leading to Donetsk, Lysychansk and Krustalny were taken under control, the city of Luhansk was surrounded. On August 14th, the so-called humanitarian convoy stopped near the Kamensk-Shakhtinsky checkpoint. For unknown reasons, the number of vehicles decreased to 262. Western journalists accompanying the column witnessed the transfer from the territory of Russia to Ukraine of at least 20 units of military hardware. On the same day, Russian terrorist forces attempted to storm Ambrosivka with the hardware that remained from Stepanivka. In order to counter the enemy's tanks, Mi-24 combat helicopters were used, and in cooperation with the anti-tank reserve, the attack was repelled. On August 15th, journalists were allowed to inspect some vehicles of the so-called humanitarian convoy. In some trucks, boards were found that were placed during the transport of tracked vehicles in order to avoid damage, and as it turned out, some of the vehicles were half empty. So this begs the rational question: why did they send half-empty vehicles? The answer is quite simple, and as always rather unpleasant. The repainted trucks were assigned to task of supplying ammunition to the terrorists and Russian troops on the territory of Ukraine. 5 days later, the first Russian supposedly humanitarian convoy entered Ukraine, bringing in fuel and ammunition supplies. In 6 days, the so-called counteroffensive of the militia was launched. The press service of the DPR headquarters announced the formation of 3 new brigades and 1 regiment, declaring a change in the tactics of combat operations. The next day after this statement, 8 battalion tactical groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation crossed the border, namely the army of Novorossiya, and entered into a confrontation with the Ukrainian army, which was exhausted by summer battles. Such was the 23rd anniversary of Ukraine's independence.